Holy Roman Empire, 962 to 1648. Although the Pope named Charlemagne Holy Roman Emperor in 800, his realm was held together largely by the force of his personality. After his death, France and Germany became separate countries, and much of Europe dissolved into a patchwork of feudal kingdoms. In the mid-10th century, the ruler of one such kingdom, Otto I of Germany, embarked on a series of campaigns in Eastern Europe and northern Italy. In exchange for his aid to the church in Italy, Pope John XII crowned him Emperor Augustus in 962, inaugurating an 846-year term of the Holy Roman Empire. Conquering Bohemia, Austria, and northern Italy, Otto controlled a large area. It was made up of many small countries, duchies, and districts governing themselves but owing allegiance to the emperor. Through their alliance with the emperor, the Pope saw this empire as a means of helping them rule over Christendom. In fact, however, the popes and the Holy Roman emperors were often at odds, each struggling for power over the other. Amidst this hegemony in the middle of the 11th century, Emperor Henry IV clashed with Pope Gregory VII over the right to appoint church officials. Excommunicated and facing revolt by his own princes, in 1077 he was forced to beg forgiveness from the Pope while kneeling in the snow outside the Pope's residence. The battle for authority continued for many more years, however, until settled by the Concordat of Worms in 1122. In the meantime, monarchies of France and England were growing more powerful and independent. The popes were forced to negotiate with them to counter the power of another powerful emperor, Frederick I, known as Frederick Barbarossa, or Redbeard, of Germany. After Frederick invaded northern Italy, the papacy enlisted the aid of these other European states to drive him back. Eventually, the Holy Roman Empire began to break free from its papal ties. The emperor was selected by a group of 7 electors within the emperor's holdings and was no longer crowned by the Pope. Indeed, during a 23-year period known as the Great Interregnum, during the 13th century, there was no emperor at all, and popes ruled themselves. In 1273, Rudolf, a member of an Austrian Habsburg family that had many landholdings, was chosen as emperor. A Habsburg would hold the title of emperor almost continuously for the next 500 years, passing it down through marriages of expediency and subsequent inheritances. In the late 15th century, for example, Emperor Maximilian I married his son Philip of Burgundy to Joanna, daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. Their son, Charles V, eventually inherited lands that made him the Holy Roman Emperor of Spain, Austria, Germany, the Netherlands, and Italy. When Charles V retired in 1556, his realm was divided among other Habsburgs. His son, Philip II, took over Spain and the Netherlands, and his brother, Ferdinand, ruled Germany and Austria. Into this emerging Europe, with the Holy Roman Empire generally opposed by England and France, the religious differences of the Reformation further complicated alliances. The western half of the continent became a patchwork of Catholics, Calvinists, Lutherans, and many other shades of Protestantism. Catholic leaders, recognizing that excesses had contributed to the rise of Protestantism, tried to correct their mistakes through counter-reforms in the Council of Trent. It was not enough. From 1618 to 1648, Catholics and Protestants fought the 30 Years' War. Though nearly all Europe was involved in the conflict, the war was fought primarily on German soil, devastating its population, agriculture, commerce, and industry. The Treaty of Westphalia, an important step towards religious toleration, brought peace. Catholics and Protestants recognized the right of the others to exist in their own states. Yet the 30 Years' War fragmented the Holy Roman Empire into some 300 increasingly nationally organized states, a striking contrast to broad patterns of political development in East Asia and the Middle East, and one that would greatly influence European economic and social change. Habsburg greatness declined, and although the empire lasted until 1806, it remained a shell, never regaining its former glory. And as you can see, this empire lasted from 962 all the way until 1806. China's Song Dynasty, 960 to 1279. After the fall of the Tang Dynasty, rival warlords ruled China for several decades. In 960, one of those warlords rose to power after his men proclaimed him emperor. Chao Kuang proceeded to overcome the other generals and regain control of much of China. Though a military man, Cao Cheng proved a reasonable and generous ruler. To reestablish central authority over many regional armies, he persuaded his various generals to retire with substantial pensions and replaced military governors with civil officials. When Chao Xuang's brother replaced him on the throne and the Song dynasty continued, the realm would be marked by a reliance on a huge civil bureaucracy. Song rulers revived and expanded the Confucian policy of appointing officials based on their performance in literary examinations. To ensure impartial results, clerks recopied the exam papers and removed the names. Tens of thousands took the exam each year, with fewer than 1% passing in some regions. Those scholars who succeeded created a large, effective, but costly civil service. With a stable government, the Song reunified most of China, but its empire was never as extensive as those of earlier dynasties. Ultimately, it could not hold the north against Tartar people, known as the Khitan tribes. A corruption of that name led Europeans to refer to China as Cathay, a term introduced by Marco Polo. Driven southward, the Song eventually controlled only central and southern China, in more limited territory, perhaps because of it. The years of the Song dynasty were prosperous. The fertile south produced more food than the mountainous north. In the mid-8th century, the Chinese population was 60 million. By 1100, it was more than 110 million, two-thirds of it in central and southern China. Trade and industry boomed, and the capital, Hangzhou, became the world's greatest city. Other cities flourished too. China became the most urbanized country in the world. Many cities had populations of greater than 100,000, and by the late 1200s, Hangzhou had more than 1 million residents. A growing urban middle class patronized art and drama. The evolution of exquisite porcelain continued. Painters created delicate landscapes on paper and silk. Because trade with Western lands was curtailed by a loss of control over the northern land routes, the Song turned into a maritime power, trading along rivers and by sea with Southeastern Asia, Indonesia, India, and the Persian Gulf. Merchants became immensely wealthy and set up complex commercial systems that included banks and credit systems. So populous and rich was the empire that it could no longer trade just in coins, which now numbered in the billions. Officials began to issue the world's first government-backed paper money. As Europe during this time was still in a period of stagnation, China was perhaps the world's greatest power, and its culture the most splendid. The country's very prosperity and its inward-looking, non-militaristic policies finally led to the Song dynasty's collapse. Landed gentry made fat by good times acquired large estates and then rented land to peasants at high rates. They wreaked peasant rebellion. Bureaucrats who, like the gentry, had been made complacent by economic success, neglected the military even as nomadic armies gained control of northern China. By 1279, the Mongol forces overran the country and ended the Song dynasty. Mongol Empire, 1206 to 1368. Throughout early Asian and European history, settled people and organized communities contended with raids from warlike nomads, pastoralist clans that generally lived in rugged high country. Sometimes these intrusions completely disrupted societies, such as those of the Roman Empire and China. In the 13th century, civilizations from the Mediterranean to the Pacific had to endure the last and most successful invasion by nomadic peoples when the Mongols conquered an empire that in scope and range exceeded anything that had come before it. Originating in the chilly steppes of Central Asia and the area now known as Mongolia, the Mongols and their rivals, the Tatars, had long bedeviled their neighbors in China. Because the barren land of the Central Asian steppes from which they originated was not highly productive, the Mongols were never a numerous people. Their success as conquerors was due to their excellent horsemanship, endurance, ferocity in battle, and superior military tactics. In their male-dominated warrior society, Mongol men took the best food for themselves and trained from childhood in archery and physical combat. They hunted on horseback, honing their skills as swift, deadly cavalrymen who were able to loose arrows with great accuracy at full gallop. Even so, their impact would have been merely regional had it not been for the leadership of a military genius named Temujin, later known as Chinggis or Genghis Khan. Born around 1162, son of a minor Mongol chieftain, Genghis Khan faced a brutal struggle for survival in his early life. After his father was poisoned by Tatar tribesmen, Temujin, or Genghis Khan, grew up in poverty and according to some stories, once escaped from captivity while his enemies were drunk. By the time he was an adult, Genghis Khan was a man to be reckoned with. Gathering allies, Genghis defeated the Tatars. In revenge for his father's death, he killed all males taller than the height of a cart axle and enslaved the women and children. As his power grew and alliances shifted, he gradually brought the 30-some nomadic tribes of Mongolia under his control, killing in the process his own brother who had opposed him. The enemies he did not kill, he enslaved or dispersed among his own tribe, so that families and tribes were broken up and old alliances could not perform behind his back. In 1206, the tribes named him Genghis Khan, universal ruler. Temujin no longer existed. He was now Genghis Khan, universal ruler. Although he commanded a relatively small population, Genghis Khan's implacable will and ruthless tactics, combined with the skill of his fabled horsemen, overwhelmed his opponents. Mongolian warriors grew up on horseback, hunting, playing, and fighting from the backs of their tough, grass-fed mounts. A mounted Mongol was a formidable force, a superb horseman armed with a lance, saber, dagger, and a bow with at least 2 quivers of arrows and a shield on his arm. Some of the arrowheads were designed to make a whistling sound to terrify the enemy. Each warrior kept as many as 4 horses so that he would always have a fresh, speedy mount available. Using catapults and siege warfare, warriors lobbed not only rocks but also diseased human carcasses into their enemy's strongholds. They never let themselves get into a regular medley, wrote Marco Polo in his travels, but keep perpetually riding around and shooting into the enemy. And as they do not count it any shame to run away in battle, they will sometimes pretend to do so, and in running away they turn in the saddle and shoot hard and strong at the foe, and in this way make great havoc. Their horses are trained so perfectly that they will double hither and hither. Thus they fight to as good purpose in running away as if they stood and faced the enemy, because of the vast volleys of arrows that they shoot in this way, turning around upon their pursuers, who are fancying that they have won the battle. With the Mongols united behind him, Genghis first turned to China, defeating the Tangut peoples who controlled oases along the lucrative Silk Road between China and lands to the west. Moving farther into China, he took bribes aimed at fending off his attacks, then sacked and massacred inhabitants anyway. Returning to Mongolia, he built a capital at Karakoram, then defeated rivals to the west. When the Shah at Samarkand killed envoys sent by Genghis to negotiate, Genghis avenged the insult by defeating the Shah's forces, even though they were superior in number to his own. Continuing westward, he overran Central Asia, Afghanistan, Persia, and parts of Russia. Many cities were demolished and townsfolk were massacred by the thousands, with some unlucky survivors saved to serve as human shields in the next battle. Genghis's army may never have exceeded 110,000 men, but they were mobile, loyal, and disciplined soldiers. When necessary, troops from conquered states were incorporated into the forces and rewarded with booty. Turks perhaps outnumbered native Mongols in Genghis's armies, and the Turkic language became the language of the invaders. Fear preceded rampages by the Mongols, who were known to slaughter the vanquished and were rumored to cannibalize the enemy dead. Despite his well-deserved reputation as a brutal conqueror, Genghis Khan was also an intellectually curious man who was quick to adapt knowledge from the cultures he conquered. In 1204, he asked an Uyghur retainer to develop the first written alphabet based on Uyghur script for the Mongols. Genghis also developed a legal code for his people called the Jaska, or Yasa. He learned about cities from the Muslims and farms from the Chinese. He respected tradesmen and artisans and often spared them in his conquests. Religiously tolerant, he welcomed Buddhists, Christians, Taoists, and others to his court. According to a Persian historian, he, quote, used to hold in esteem beloved and respected sages and hermits of every tribe, considering this a procedure to please God, end quote. Genghis Khan died in 1227, but his sons and grandsons continued to expand Mongol territory. By the late 13th century, the Mongol Empire stretched from the borders of Hungary to the Sea of Japan. It consisted of 4 khanates. China, wealthiest and most powerful of the conquered lands, was ruled by the Great Khans. Central Asia was controlled by the Chagatais. Persia was ruled by the Ilkhans, and Russia was the domain of the so-called Golden Horde. Perhaps the greatest of Genghis's descendants was his grandson, Kublai Khan, who became China's Great Khan in 1260. It was Kublai Khan who brought an end to southern China's great Song dynasty after conquering its capital at Hangzhou. By 1279, he had proclaimed himself Emperor of China and established his own Chinese dynasty, the Yuan. Like his grandfather, Kublai was an intelligent and enterprising ruler, interested in learning about Chinese culture and institutions, as well as the beliefs of outsiders. Probably the most famous of his visitors to Western readers was the young Italian merchant and adventurer Marco Polo, who met the Great Khan in 1275. Marco Polo described Kublai admiringly, quote, "He is of a good stature, neither tall nor short, but of a middle height. He has a becoming amount of flesh and is very shapely in all his limbs. His complexion is white and red, the eyes black and fine, the nose well formed and well set on. The Great Khan is, I tell you, the wisest and most accomplished man, the greatest captain, the best to govern men and rule an empire, as well as the most valiant there ever has existed among all the tribes of Tartars." End quote. More cultivated than his ancestors, Kublai Khan supported the arts and continued the Mongol tradition of religious tolerance, supporting a wide variety of faiths from Buddhism to Christianity. However, the Mongols never truly integrated themselves into Chinese society. They and the Chinese they ruled each held each other in mutual contempt. Despite his domination of China, Kublai Khan was unable to extend his empire farther to the east. Attempted invasions of Vietnam, Cambodia, Burma, and Java all failed. 2 attempts to take Japan were thwarted. Once, when his invading fleet encountered a typhoon that destroyed much of the fleet, the Japanese called it the kamikaze, the divine wind. After Kublai's death in 1294, Mongol rulers in China began to run into difficulties. Although they adopted the Chinese system of paper money, they did not maintain adequate reserves to support it, which led to inflation. A devastating plague broke out in southwestern China and spread across the country, the same plague that would reach Europe as the Black Death. Peasant rebellions and court power struggles weakened Mongol control, and finally Chinese forces drove the Mongols out of China in 1368. At about the same time that Kublai Khan was establishing himself as the Great Khan, his brother was overthrowing the Abbasid Empire in Persia. After crossing the Oxus River in 1256, he destroyed the fortress of the infamous Assassins sect of Alamut before attacking the Abbasid capital of Baghdad. There, Hulagu's forces massacred more than 200,000 Persians and executed the caliph, supposedly by rolling him up in a carpet and trampling him to death, as there were superstitions about shedding his blood. He founded the Ilkhanid dynasty in Persia. As terrifying as the Mongol forces were, they were not invincible. In 1260, Mongol armies were defeated by the Mamluks of Egypt, giving some hope to beleaguered peoples throughout Asia. Unlike their brethren in China, the Mongols in Persia worked well with local administrators and began to blend into Persian culture. After Kublai's death, ties among the various khanates began to weaken, and eventually the Persian Khan, Ilkhan, Ghazan, a descendant of Hulagu, converted to Islam. After Ghazan's death in 1304, Mongol control over Persia weakened, and the government returned to the Turks in the 14th century. One of Genghis Khan's grandsons, Batu, brought the fear of the Mongols to Europe in a series of campaigns in the mid-13th century. Northern Russian principalities were defeated in a lightning winter campaign from 1237 to 38, the only successful winter campaign against Russia in history. Kiev fell in 1240. In 1241, Batu annihilated a German-Polish army in Poland, and all Europe lay before his seemingly unstoppable fighting machine. Batu's forces might have reached the Atlantic had it not been for perhaps the most fortunate demise in European history. One of Genghis Khan's sons and his successor, the great Khan Ogagde, died in the Mongol capital of Karakoram, and Batu turned around and headed eastward with his troops to safeguard his position in the line of succession. The Mongol rulers of Russia gradually fell under Turkish and Islamic influence, living mainly on the steppes They ruled over an area ranging from the Urals to Siberia and southward to the Ilkhanate of Persia. They collected tribute from subject peoples, including Russians and Greeks, and traded throughout the Mediterranean. Eventually, the Russian subjects became powerful enough to overthrow them in the 15th century. Although it is clear in historical hindsight that the Mongols posed a major threat to Europe, at the time European leaders viewed them with some hope. Islam was the enemy that held Europe's attention. The fact that the Mongols were not Muslim and were attacking the Islamic Empire from behind, as it were, led the Roman Catholic Church to send various ambassadors to the Khans hoping for an alliance. However, the Church's request that the Khans come to Rome for baptism met with contempt. The Khans did not serve the Pope. They replied, the Pope should serve the Khans. Whoever recognizes and submits to the Son of God and Lord of the world, the great Khan, will be saved. Whoever refuses will be annihilated, was the typical blunt reply of Guyuk Khan, Genghis Khan's grandson, to an Italian monk. After Kublai Khan's death, the huge empire broke apart. The Mongols lost control of Persia and China and began to be assimilated in Russia. However, there was to be one more surge of conquest before nomadic power waned completely. This time, the great threat came not from a Mongol, but from a Turk who emulated their methods. In the late 14th century, Timur the Lame, now known as Tamerlane, came to power. As ferocious as his hero, Genghis Khan, from whom he claimed descent, this ruler of Samarkand conquered Persia, Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, and a portion of Russia. He attacked India, sacking Delhi in 1398 and killing most of its people. He destroyed those of his own religion, Muslims, as readily as he did Asiatic Christians. Tamerlane turned his army toward China but died on the way there in 1405, ending the era of Mongol conquest. Despite his brutality, Tamerlane was a patron of the arts and sciences who transformed the cities of Central Asia into some of the most fabulous centers of learning in the Muslim world. With his death, the lands he conquered were split among his heirs, who controlled them for about a century. By this time, however, firearms had neutralized somewhat the athleticism that had marked Mongol success in battle. The Chinese and Russians, who had suffered the most from their incursions, were able to control the fierce herdsmen on the steppes. Gradually, the Mongols lost or were absorbed into the lands they conquered.